bin Laden was not a religious scholar. His training was an engineer. Some biographers claim that he was a playboy for much of his youth. But really, these ideas, and I think that's probably why they chose the Twin Towers. I mean, this is an imagination fueled by training in engineering. I mean, a lot of the sociology, if you do a kind of prosopography of a lot of these leading jihadists, their backgrounds are not in Islamic scholarship, but actually in engineering and kind of practical sciences and professions. Medical doctors are among their ranks. And so there's long been a tension between Islamic scholars who devote their whole lives to study of texts and commentary and interpretation, and then what some scholars call kind of new intellectuals, new Muslim authorities, who actually have secular university educations, often in the natural sciences or engineering and technical fields, who then bring that kind of mindset, if you will, to what Muslim scholars call the religious sciences, which are, a field of kind of ambiguity and of gradation and of subtlety and nuance, and really of decades of training before one becomes authoritative to speak about issues like whether or not it's legitimate to take someone else's life.
With the relation to Afghanistan, who was bin Laden?
Bin Laden was a visitor. If we look at his whole life course, part of it is an enigma still. He is from a Saudi elite family, but a family that kind of has a Yemeni, Arabian Sea kind of genealogy. So the family has no relationship to Afghanistan, past or present, except at some point in the 1980s when he went, like thousands of other young Saudis, first to Pakistan, to places like Peshawar on the border, where they wanted to aid the jihad in some capacity. And for the most part, the Arabs who went opened up hospitals, some opened up schools. The bin Laden family had long been based in engineering, construction. So it's thought that he used some of those skills and resources and connections to build things. We have images of him firing a gun for show, right? It's not clear that he ever actually fired a gun in what we would call combat. Again, I could be corrected by this, and I think there are competing accounts of who he was. So he's kind of many of these figures that who sit at the pinnacle of this world are, fictive heroes that people, map their aspirations onto, right? And so people like Mullah Omar, who was then head of the Taliban, was rarely seen in public. The current head of the Taliban is almost never seen in public. There's a kind of studied air of mystery that they've cultivated to make themselves available for all kinds of fantasies, right?
Do you think he believed, so his religious beliefs, do you think he believed some of the more extreme things that enable him to commit terrorist acts? Maybe put another way, what makes a man want to become a terrorist? And what aspect of bin Laden made him want to be a terrorist?
Great. Let me offer some observations. I think, there are others who know more about bin Laden and have far more expertise in Al-Qaeda. So I'm coming at this in an adjacent way, kind of from Afghanistan and from my historical training. So this is my 2 cents. So, bear with me. I don't have the authoritative account.
Which in itself is fascinating because you're a historian of Afghanistan, and the fact that bin Laden isn't a huge part of your focus of study just means that bin Laden is not a key part of the history of Afghanistan, except that America made him a key part of the history of Afghanistan.
I would endorse that. Definitely. That's it. You put it in a very pithy way. So listen, he was an engineer. He was said to be a playboy, who spent a lot of cash from his family. Like many young Saudis and from some other countries, he was inspired by this idea that there was jihad in Afghanistan. It was going to take down one of the two superpowers, the Soviet Union, who, the Red Army did murder hundreds of thousands, perhaps as many as 2 million Afghan civilians during that conflict. It's very, plausible and very, completely understandable that many young people would see that cause as, the righteous, pious fighters for jihad, who call themselves mujahideen, arrayed against this evil empire, right? Of a godless Soviet empire that, I mean, there's even confusion about what the Soviets wanted, right? Now we know much more about like what the Kremlin wanted, what Brezhnev wanted, and how the Soviet elite thought about it because we have many more of their records. But from the outside, for Jimmy Carter and then for Reagan, it looked like the Soviets were making a move on South Asia because they wanted to get to the warm water ports, which Russians always want supposedly, right? And it was kind of a move to take over our oil and, to assert world domination, right? So there are lots of ways in which this looked like good versus evil. In Congress, it looked like, kind of Vietnam again, but this time this was our chance to get them. And there are lots of great quotes. Disturbing, but really revealing quotes that American policymakers made about wanting to give the Soviets their Vietnam. So the CIA funneled, hundreds of millions of dollars into this project to back the Mujahideen, who Reagan called freedom fighters. And so bin Laden was part of that universe. He's part of that. He's swimming in the ocean of these Afghan Mujahideen who, I would emphasize, did 95% of the fighting. They're the ones who died. They're the ones who defeated the Red Army, right? The Arabs who were there did a little fighting, but a lot of it was for, their purposes. It was to get experience. It was to kind of create their reputations, like bin Laden began to forge for himself, of being spokesman for a global project. Because by the late 80s, when bin Laden, I think, was more active and began conspiring with people from other Arab countries, the idea that, when Gorbachev came to power in 85, he's like, let's get out of here. This is draining the Soviet budget. It's an embarrassment. We didn't think about this properly. Let's focus on restoring the party and strengthening the Soviet Union. Let's get out of this costly war. It's a waste. It's not worth it. We don't lose anything by getting out of Afghanistan. And so their retreat was quite effective and successful from the Soviet point of view, right? It's not what we're seeing now.
What year was the retreat?
It began. So Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. He was a generation younger than the other guys. He was a critic of the system. He didn't want to abolish it. He wanted to reform it. He was a true believer in Soviet socialism and in the party as a monopolist, right? Mm-hmm. But he's critical of the old guard and recognized that the party had to change and the whole system had to change to continue to compete. And so Afghanistan was one element of this. And so he pushed the Afghan elites that Moscow was backing to basically say, listen, we're going to share power. And so a figure named Najibullah, who was a Soviet-trained intelligence specialist sitting in Kabul, agreed. And he said, we need to have a more kind of pluralistic, accommodationist approach to our enemies, who are backed by the U.S. mainly, sitting in Pakistan, sitting in Iran, backed by these Arabs to a degree, getting money from Saudi. And he said, let's draw some of them into the government and basically have a kind of unity government that would make some space to the opposition. And for the most part, with U.S. backing, with Pakistani backing, with Iranian backing, and with Saudi backing, the opposition said, no, we're not going to reconcile. We're going to push you off the cliff. And so that story goes on from at least 1987. The last Soviet Red Army troops leave early 1989. But the Najibullah government holds on for 3 more years. It is they're still getting some help from the Soviet Union. Its enemies are still getting help from the U.S. mainly. And it's not until 1992 that they lose. And then the Mujahideen come to power. They immediately, they're deeply fractured.
And that's where bin Laden is watching all of this unroll.
That's right. And he's part of the mix, but he's also mobile. So he at one point, goes, is in Sudan. He's moving from place to place. His people are all over the world. In fact, if you think of once the Mujahideen take power, they have difficulties with the Arab fighters too. And they don't want them coming in and, messing with the Mujahideen regard this as like, this is an Afghan national state that we're going to build. It's going to be Islamic. It's going to be an Islamic state, but you can't interfere with us. And so there are always tensions. And so the Arabs are always I would say the Arab fighters were always interlopers. Yes, the Afghans are happy to take their money, send patients to their hospitals, take their weapons, but they're never going to let this be like a Saudi or Egyptian or whatever project. Mm-hmm. But then many of those fighters went home. They went back to Syria. They went back to Egypt. Some wanted to go back to Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis were very careful. I mean, the Saudis always used Afghanistan as a kind of safety valve. In fact, they had fundraisers on television. They chartered jets. They filled them with people to fly to Pakistan, get out in Peshawar and say, go fight. And it was one way that the monarchy, the Saudi monarchy, very cleverly, I think, created a kind of escape valve for would-be dissidents in Saudi Arabia, right? Just send them abroad. You want to fight jihad, go do that somewhere else. Don't bother the kingdom. But all this became dicier in the early 90s when some of these guys came back home, and some of the scholars around them said, we've defeated the Soviet Union, which is a huge, huge boost. And I think part of the dynamic we see today is that the Taliban victory is a renewed inspiration for people who think, look, we beat the Soviets, now we beat the Americans. And so already watching the Soviet retreat across this bridge back into Uzbekistan, if you see these dramatic images of the tanks, moving, a lot of people interpret this as like, we are going to change the world. And now we're turning to the Americans. And our local national governments are backed by the Americans. So let's start with those places. And then let's go strike, the belly of the beast, which is America, which is New York. And going back to bin Laden, your question about, what motivated him, again, he was not a rigorously trained Islamic scholar. And that, I think, when this comes up in our classes, I think, especially young people, people who weren't even born on 9/11, they're shocked. They see his appearance. They see him pictured in front of a giant bookshelf of Arabic books. He's got the Kalashnikov. He's got what looks like a religious scholar's library behind him, right? But if you look at his words, one fascinating thing about just our politics, and just one thing that kind of sums all this up, the fact that on 9/11, we had to have a few experts, people like Barnett Rubin, who was an Afghanistan expert. So that was one way in which I think, I'm not faulting him personally, but it's just one way in which that relationship appeared to be, formed, right, of linking Afghanistan to that moment. If one looks actually, at what bin Laden was saying and doing, people like Richard Clarke were studying this. There were Arab leaders. The Arab press was watching this because he gave some of his first interviews to a few Arab newspaper outlets. But speaking of our American kind of, monolingualism, a lot of what he was saying wasn't known. And so I think for several years, people weren't reading what bin Laden said. Experts are reading it in Arabic, but there was great anxiety around translating his works. So, we have Mein Kampf, we have all this other stuff. You can buy the collected works of Lenin, Stalin, Mao, whatever you want, in whatever language you want. But bin Laden was taboo for American publishing. And so it was only Verso in the UK that published a famous volume called Messages to the World, which was the first compendium of bin Laden's writings.
So he has a Mein Kampf. He has a type. Does he have a thing?
It's a kind of collected works. It's a collected works.
Okay.
Of his.
He had like a blog. It's a collection of articles versus.
Yeah, these are interviews. These are his missives, his declarations, his decrees, right? But I think just in terms of, if we zoom out for a second about American policy choices and so on, the powers that be didn't trust us to know what he was really about. I put it that way, and I don't say that in a conspiratorial sense. I just think that it was, it was a taboo. I think people, there was a kind of consensus that, trust us. We know how to fight Al Qaeda, right. And you don't need to know what they're about because they're crazy. They're fanatics. They're fundamentalists. They hate us. Remember that language?
Yeah.
It's us versus them. But if you read bin Laden, that's when it gets messy. That's where bin Laden's argumentation is not fundamentally about Islam. And if you were sitting here with an Islamic scholar, he would say, depending on which Islamic scholar, they would tend to go through and dissect and negate 99% of the arguments that bin Laden claimed was in Islam, right? But what strikes me as an historian who's, again, looking at this adjacently, if you read bin Laden, the arguments that he make are, first of all, they're sophisticated. They reflect a mind that is about geopolitics. He uses terms like imperialism. He knows something about world history. He knows something about geography.
So imperialism is the enemy for him, or what's the nature of the enemy?
It's an amalgam, and he, like a good politician, which is what I would call him, he is adept at speaking in different ways to different audiences. So if you look at the context in which he speaks, if you look at messages to the world, if you look at his writings, and you can zoom out now, and we now have compendia of the writings of Al Qaeda more broadly. You can purchase these. They're basically primary source collections. We now have that for the Taliban. I mean, what's fascinating about, I think, if you like this culture, acknowledging it's very, diverse internally, is that these people are representatives of political movements who seek followers. They speak. They often are very, I'd say, skilled at visual imagery. And especially now, I mean, what's fascinating is that, I mean, the Taliban, used to shoot televisions. They used to, blow up VCR, videotapes. They used to string audio and video cassettes from trees and kind of ceremonial hangings, right? That we're killing this nefarious infidel technology that is doing the work of Satan. And yet today, one of the keys to the Taliban success is that they got really good at using media. I mean, brilliant at using the written word, the spoken word, music, actually. And Hollywood is the gold standard. And these guys have studied how to create drama, how to speak to modern users. I mean, Islamic State did this. I mean, the role of media, new media. I mean, I follow and I am followed by senior Taliban leaders, which is, bizarre, on Twitter.
Twitter?
I don't know why they care about me. I'm nothing.
They follow you on Twitter.
I don't know why. This is no joke. So they are part of our modern world, and it's how they talk, and it's how they recruit, and this is why they are, so Bin Laden, if you read Bin Laden, he speaks multiple languages, I would say. It's environmentalism. The West is bad because we destroyed the planet. The West is bad because we abuse women. So in class, especially, female students are very surprised to learn and actually say, this feminist argument is not, we start with, this is a murder. This is a person who has taken human life, innocent life, over and over again. And he is, aspirationally genocidal. But let's try to understand what he's about. So we walk through the texts, read them, and people are shocked to learn that it's not just about, quotations from the Quran strung together in some irrational fashion. Mm-hmm. He knows, at the core, I'd say, is the problem of human suffering. And he has a geography of that is mostly Muslim, but he talks about the suffering of Kashmir. All right, so if you have a student in your class who's from South Asia, who knows about Kashmir, he or she will say, that's not entirely inaccurate. Yeah. The Indian state commits atrocities in Kashmir. Pakistanis doing that too. Palestine is an issue, right? So you have, in the American university setting, people across the spectrum who get that, Palestinians have had a raw deal. And so it's victimhood is central, and it's Muslim victimhood, which is primary. But as a number of scholars have written, and I definitely think this is a framework for what that's useful. I mean, in this kind of vocabulary, in this framing, in this narrative, in today's world, if we think of today's world being post-Cold War, 91 to the present, looking at the series of Gulf Wars, and seeing the visuals of that, I think that, I think the American public has been shielded from some of this. But if you look at, the carnage of the Iraqi army that George H.W. Bush produced, right? Or you think of, the images of the suffering of Iraqi children under George H.W. Bush's sanctions, U.S.-British airstrikes. And then you have Madeleine Albright answer a question on 60 Minutes saying, do you think, the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi kids is worth it? Is that justified to contain Saddam Hussein? And she says on camera, yes, that it's worth it to me. If you put that all together, I mean, American kids, and of course the American public, they're not always aware of those facts of global history, but these guys are, and they very capably use these images, use these tropes, and use facts. I mean, some of these things are not deniable. I mean, these estimates about the number of Iraqi civilian children dead, that came from, I think, the Lancet, and it came from, those are estimates. But looking at this from the point of view of Amman, of Jaffa, of Nairobi, just think around the planet. And if you see yourself as the victim of this great imperial power, you can see why especially young men would be drawn to a road of self-sacrifice. And the idea is that in killing others, you are making them feel how you feel.
Yeah.
Because they won't listen to your arguments reasonably, because they won't, recognize Palestinian suffering, Bosnian suffering, right? Chechen suffering. You go across the planet, right? Because they won't recognize our suffering, we're going to speak to you in the only language that you understand, and that's violence. And look at the violence of the post-1991 world, right? In which American air power really becomes a global, kind of fact in the lives of so many people. And then the big mistake after 9/11, among many, fundamentally was taking the war on terror to some, 30 or 40 countries, right? So that you have more and more of the globe feel like they're under attack, right? And the logic is that essentially it's for bin Laden, it's not, we're going to convert you and turn you into Muslims, and that's why we're doing this. That claim does appear at times, but if you look at any given bin Laden text, there are 40 claims in each text. It's dizzying, but he's a modern politician. He knows the language of social equality, that there's a class dimension to it. There is an environmental dimension to it. There's a gender dimension to it. And yes, there are chronic quotes sprinkled in. And when he wants to speak that language, he knew that, he's not a scholar. So he would often get a few recognized scholars to sign on. So some of his declarations of jihad had his signature kind of sprinkled in with like a dozen other signatures from people who are somewhat known, or at least, with titles, right? So as a kind of intellectual exercise, it's fascinating to see that he is throwing everything at the wall at one level. That's one way to see that these are kind of testaments toward recruitment of people who, yes, they're angry, yes, they're unhappy. And this is what, I think for a broader public, it's hard to get, you're like, well, bin Laden didn't suffer. He wasn't poor.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, Lenin, Pol Pot.
They're speaking to, they're empathetic to the suffering, the landscape, the full landscape of suffering. Yeah. It's interesting to think about suffering. America, the American public, American politicians and leaders, when they see what is good and evil, they're often not empathetic to the suffering of others. And what you're saying is bin Laden perhaps accurately could speak to the ignorance of America, maybe the Soviet Union, to the suffering of their people.